That night my daughter woke up screaming. Not from pain. Not a nightmare. Out of fear. And before I even reached the bedroom door, he was already there. My German Shepherd, sitting on the floor, blocking the passage. His eyes fixed on the darkness of the hallway, he growled softly, as if he were seeing something I couldn't. That's where it all began. I've always believed that dogs sense things that we don't understand. But that week I noticed something different about Bob. He wouldn't leave my daughter's side at night, he refused to sleep in another room, he wouldn't accept food, he didn't accept affection. Just stayed there. Property. Watching. I thought he was just being overprotective. Until one early morning, exhausted, I decided to install a camera in the hallway. And what I saw in the recording changed my life forever. That summer, the city was strangely quiet, no children playing in the street, no neighbors chatting on the sidewalks, without the usual sound of cars passing by after 9 o'clock at night. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. My daughter, Emily, was only 6 years old. She was a light-hearted, curious child who laughed easily. But that week, she started waking up crying every night, saying the same thing. Mom. Someone is watching me. I was trying to calm her down. He said it was a dream, and no one could enter that house without making noise, that we were safe. But Bob disagreed with me. Every night, at precisely 2 in the morning, he would get up, walk slowly to the hallway, and stand in front of Emily's bedroom door. Seated. Rigid, pay attention. If I tried to call him, he wouldn't come, that if I tried to push him to leave. He resisted, not aggressive, but firm like a living wall. On the third night, I woke up and found my daughter sitting on the bed, hugging her knees, looking at the door. He's there again. I looked, Bob was in the same place. Nose held high, tense ears. The whole body is ready to react. Honey, it's just Bob protecting you, I said, trying to smile. But deep down I felt it too. Something was wrong in that house. The next morning I found strange marks on the backyard fence. Footprints that weren't from a dog. Deep marks in the ground, as if someone had stood there for a long time, watching the house. I showed it to the police. They said it was probably an animal. Bob didn't accept that answer. That night, he didn't even go to bed, he stood there, motionless, for hours. And it was there that I realized. My dog wasn't just protecting me. He was waiting. By the fourth night, I couldn't sleep anymore. It wasn't just because of Emily's screams. Not just because of Bob's strange behavior. It was that constant feeling of being watched, as if the house itself had eyes. I would lie down, close my eyes. And something inside me refused to relax. At 2 o'clock sharp, I heard the familiar sound of Bob's fingernails on the wooden floor. Slow pace, deliberate, as if he knew exactly where he was going. I got up silently and followed him into the hallway. He stopped in the same place as always. Right in front of Emily's bedroom door. But that night something was different. His body was trembling. Not from the cold. Not from tiredness. It was tense. Muscles tense, neck stiff, eyes fixed on the end of the corridor, the same spot where the light didn't fully reach. I knelt beside him and whispered, Bob. What are you seeing? He didn't move, he didn't even blink. That's when I heard the noise. Slight creaking sound, very light. Like the sound of a foot pressing against a loose board. I turned my head quickly, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Even so, Bob began to growl. Whoa. Deep that it wasn't a warning growl, it was a growl off comparison. I got up and walked to Emily's door. Daughter, is everything all right? She replied in a trembling voice. He's behind you right now. My blood ran cold. Who, darling? The man. I didn't turn around. Not immediately. Because, deep down, I was afraid that if I looked, I would confirm something that I wasn't ready to accept yet. I picked Emily up and took her to my room. Bob came up behind us, right next to us. His eyes still fixed on the hallway. I put my daughter to bed and locked the door. That night nobody slept. And the next day I decided to install the camera. Not out of curiosity, but for survival. I spent the entire morning installing the camera in the hallway. It wasn't sophisticated at all. One of those small ones with night vision, connected to your cell phone. But it was enough to show me everything my eyes weren't able to see. I placed the device high on the shelf, facing directly towards the spot where Bob always positioned himself. While I was working, I noticed my daughter watching me from the bedroom doorway. She didn't ask anything. It wasn't necessary. There was something in her eyes that I had never seen before. A mixture of fear and acceptance, as if deep down she already knew the danger was real. That afternoon, the sky darkened earlier than usual. The wind began to bang against the windows. The trees in the backyard moved unsettlingly, creaking as if trying to warn of something. Bob didn't leave my side all day. Not even for drinking water. Not even for bed. As night fell, he walked back down the hallway, as if following a script known only to him. I sat in the living room, phone in hand, watching the live stream from the camera. The image was normal. Empty hallway. Silence. At 2 o'clock sharp, Bob entered the camera's field of vision. He sat in the exact same spot as every night. But this time he wasn't just watching. He leaned slightly forward. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The growling began. And then, the camera captured something that shouldn't have been there. Shadow. Not an ordinary shadow. She was tall. Fine. Too elongated to be human. She moved slowly along the hallway wall, as if she were being projected by someone walking outside the camera's field of vision. But there was nobody there. My heart started beating so hard I could barely breathe. The shadow approached the door of Emily's room. Bob took a step forward. He growled louder. The shadow stopped. He stood there, motionless, as if he were watching the dog. For long seconds nothing happened. Then the shadow receded. Disappeared. Bob stayed there until dawn. And I sat on the living room floor, hugging my knees, trying to understand what kind of thing was lurking around my house. I didn't tell Emily anything that morning. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that something invisible was walking around the house at night? I prepared breakfast as if everything were normal. I packed her backpack. I kissed her on the forehead before dropping her off at school. But as I walked back home, the camera recording wouldn't leave my head. In the shade that I in an unnatural way. The way she stood in front of Bob. As if he were evaluating. As soon as I arrived, I sat on the sofa and watched the video one more time. The shadow did not appear at any other point in the recording. Only during that interval. Only that early morning. And Bob remained restless all day long. He was pacing back and forth. He stared intently down the hallway, even though the house was lit by the sun. In the afternoon, I decided to talk to my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Margaret, a lady who had lived there for over 30 years and knew every inch of that street. I told them about the marks on the fence, about my daughter's nightmares, regarding Bob's strange behavior. She remained silent for a long moment. Then he said, "This house has been empty for a long time before you arrived." "Why?" I asked. "The last family left in a hurry. In the middle of the night. They never came back." My stomach churned. "What happened to them?" She lowered her voice. "Their daughter said the same things as yours. That someone was staring at her from the hallway." I returned home with ice-cold hands. That night, I sat in Emily's room until she fell asleep. Bob lay down on the floor beside me, alert as always. When I turned off the light and closed the door, he slowly walked to his lookout post. At 2 o'clock sharp, the growling began again. I picked up my cell phone and opened the camera feed. The hallway was empty. For a few seconds. Then, the shadow returned. And this time, she was closer to my daughter's door than ever before. In the recording from that early morning, the shadow not only appeared, she moved. She slid down the hallway wall in a way that's impossible to describe properly, as if she weren't attached to the floor or the logic of the space. Bob took 2 steps forward. He growled louder. His entire body positioned itself between the shadow and Emily's door. That's when something happened that made my hand start shaking so much that I almost dropped my phone. The shadow stopped. And, for a very brief second, the camera captured a detail that I hadn't seen before. Face contour. It wasn't clear, but you could make out something like eyes, a nose, and an open mouth, too long, too dark. Bob Latin. A unique, strong bark like a command. The shadow recoiled abruptly and disappeared. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of my daughter's bed, holding her hand while she slept. In the morning I took the video to the police. They watched in silence. One of them said it could be a lighting problem. Another person mentioned camera interference. Nobody believed me. When I got home, I found Bob in the yard, standing in front of the fence, staring at the same spot where I had seen the marks days before. The ground was disturbed, and there was something new there. A piece of fabric caught in the barbed wire. It was dark. It smelled of mold. At that moment, a horrible idea began to form in my mind. What if that wasn't just a shadow? What if someone was actually coming to my house every night? But what the camera showed was only the part that my eyes couldn't see. That night, I didn't wait until 2 o'clock. I hid in my room, lights off, phone in hand, watching the live stream. Bob took his seat in the aisle earlier than usual. At 1:57, the air inside the house grew heavy, difficult to breathe. At 2 o'clock sharp, the hallway began to darken, and the shadow returned. But this time she didn't come alone. On the phone screen the runner looked different. It wasn't just darker, it was as if the image itself was becoming deeper, thicker, as if the air had transformed into something heavy, almost solid. Bob started pacing back and forth. The ears are drooping, the stiff tail, his gaze fixed on the same spot where the shadow always appeared. Then she appeared. The same elongated shape. Too high, too thin. But now, beside her, another shadow began to take shape. Minor. Lower. The two moved together. Sliding. The younger one seemed unstable, as if she were being pulled. Bob immediately positioned himself between them and Emily's door. His growl echoed down the hallway. And, for the first time since it all began, I heard something other than a growl. Faint sound. Like a whisper. The camera didn't capture audio, but I could hear it in my head, as if the very air in the house was whispering something. The longer shadow tilted. The younger one seemed to back away. That's when something completely out of the ordinary happened. Bob stepped forward. Not to attack, but to block. He positioned himself in front of the larger shadow and slowly began to push it back, as if he were confronting a formless body. The camera image was distorted. For a second, the hallway disappeared from the screen. When he returned, the two shadows had disappeared. Bob remained standing, breathing heavily, staring at the empty space for several minutes. That night, I slept with my daughter in my room, door locked, light on, Bob lying across the doorway. This morning I found something on the hallway floor. Brand. Not standing up. Not by foot. Something dragged out. As if something had been pulled out of the house against its will. And at that moment, I understood something with frightening clarity. Whatever was coming that way, I wasn't leaving by choice. It was being prevented. The next morning I took Emily to school and, for the first time, I didn't go straight home. I drove to the city library. I needed to understand what had happened in that house before I moved in. I needed to know who had lived there. And why had that family fled in the middle of the night? I spent hours searching through old records, newspapers, and police reports, until I found a small note in a local newspaper, from almost 20 years ago. 7-year-old girl mysteriously disappears from her home on Maple Street. Parents claim to have heard voices and seen shadows in the days leading up to her disappearance. My heart almost stopped. The address was the same. I continued reading. The girl was never found. The parents abandoned the house a few days later. They were never seen in the city again. I returned home with the feeling that the world had become narrower around me. Bob was in his usual spot, sitting across the hallway, even with the high sun streaming through the windows. I approached and knelt beside him. "You know, don't you?" He didn't look at me, but his posture adjusted, as if he were recognizing that I was finally beginning to understand. That night I stayed awake, holding a flashlight, sitting behind my bedroom door watching the camera feed. At 2 o'clock sharp, the temperature in the house dropped. Not only got colder, it fell abruptly. My breath became noticeable. The larger shadow appeared first, then the smallest one. And this time, the smaller shadow tried to move around Bob. That's when I realized. The younger girl was not entering the house. She was trying to leave. And the biggest, I was trying to take her back. Bob moved faster than ever before. He positioned his body between the two and forced the larger shadow to retreat. The corridor distorted again. The smaller shadow dissipated slowly, like smoke being blown away. The larger one remained motionless for a long time. Then he walked away. That night, Emily slept without waking up once. And for the first time since the beginning of it all, the house fell silent. But I knew. It wasn't over yet. The following days were strangely calm. Emily smiled again. She stopped waking up crying Bob for the first time in weeks, started eating normally again, and even lay down to sleep for a few hours during the day. But I couldn't relax. The feeling of threat was still there, hidden in every corner of the house, as if something was just waiting for the right moment to return. On the third night after the confrontation in the hallway, something new happened. At 2 o'clock sharp, as always, Bob stood up. But this time he didn't go straight to the hallway. He stopped at the front door. He stood there, staring at the doorknob, growling softly. The hallway camera wasn't showing anything. I grabbed my phone and turned on the living room camera. The place was empty. Even so, Bob began to back away slowly, as if he were being pressed down by something invisible. The hair on the back of his neck stood completely on end. The air inside the house became heavy again. Then I heard the sound. It wasn't coming from the recording. It came from home. A slight scratch on the front door. It wasn't a hit that it wasn't a blow. It was as if someone were lightly running their fingernail across the wood. Provoking. Bob let out a dry, aggressive bark and lunged at the door. The sound stopped immediately. For several seconds nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps in the backyard. Boards, rag, surrounding the house. The shadow was no longer confined to the hallway. She had found another way. That night I couldn't stay still anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, slowly unlocked the front door, and peeked into the backyard. The air was heavy, almost still. There no wind, there no sounds of insects. Absolute silence. Bob went out first, step by step, his muscles tense, his gaze scanning the darkness. I followed him, my heart racing. The backyard fence was open. The gate, which I always locked, swayed gently, as if someone had just passed through. The beam of the flashlight illuminated the ground near the fence. The brands were back, deeper, closer to home. I followed the footprints to the side of the building. There I found something that made me swallow hard. Well, old, dirty, missing one eye. It wasn't Emily's. I had never seen that doll before. Bob approached, sniffed the object and began to growl, immediately recoiling as if the toy were poisonous. At that moment I felt something behind me. Presence. I'll turn around quickly. There was nobody there. But the air was different at that spot, colder, denser, as if the space had been occupied by something invisible. I gathered the doll with a cloth, took it inside, and placed it on the kitchen table. That night nobody slept. And just before dawn, I heard something I'll never forget. A whisper coming from the hallway. Not a clear word, but a voice calling. And the voice, she wasn't an adult. When I heard that whisper, my whole body went stiff. He wasn't tall, he wasn't aggressive. She was fragile. Like the voice of a child calling out in the dark because they are afraid of being alone. Bob raised his head instantly. Ears pointed toward the hallway. The whole body alert. "Emily," I whispered, my throat dry. No response. I walked to my daughter's bedroom door. She was fast asleep, hugging her pillow. The whisper returned, clearer now. "Mommy." My heart raced. The voice was coming from the hallway. Bob immediately positioned himself between me and the sound, as if to say, "Don't go." But something inside me needed to understand. I grabbed the flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The light traveled down the hallway, revealing only empty walls, the wooden floor, and closed doors. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice almost failing. No response. But at the spot where the shadow used to appear, I saw something new. The doll. The same dirty doll that I had left on the kitchen table. Now she was sitting on the hallway floor, directly facing Emily's room. Bob let out a deep growl and lunged forward, nudging the doll with his paw. She rolled against the wall and lay there, lying on her side. At that moment, the whispering ceased. The air returned to normal. Silence filled the house. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of Emily's bed, with Bob lying at my feet, without closing my eyes. The next morning, I decided I couldn't handle this alone anymore. I needed help. But I still had no idea who could help me understand what was happening in that house. And why did it all seem to be connected to my daughter? The next morning, I took Emily to school earlier than usual. Before leaving, I watched Bob for a few seconds. He stared at me with those attentive, serious eyes, as if he were trying to tell me something that words would never be enough to explain. "I'll take care of it," I promised in a low voice. He came closer and touched his snout to my hand. I drove to the oldest part of town, where the church and the small community center were located. I wasn't a particularly religious person, but I needed to talk to someone who had seen more of life than I had. Father Thomas received me in his office. He was an elderly man with a soft voice and a firm gaze. I told them everything. The shadows. The whispers. Bob's behavior. The doll. He listened in silence, without interrupting me. When I finished, he took a deep breath. "This street," he murmured, "was linked to a very sad case many years ago." "The girl who disappeared," I said. He looked up, surprised. "Do you know that? That child was never found. But some believe she never really left." My stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means that some pains don't find relief easily. I returned home with the feeling that I had entered into something much bigger than myself. That afternoon, Emily arrived home from school strangely quiet. "Mommy," she said, holding my hand, "the little girl wants to play with me." My heart almost stopped. "Which girl, dear?" "That no runner lives." Bob, who was lying near the door, suddenly raised his head and began to growl. He knew. Time was running out. I spent that entire afternoon unable to think about anything other than Emily's words. The girl who lives in the hallway. I didn't tell her anything about what I was seeing in the recordings. I didn't mention the doll. I didn't talk about the shadows. But somehow she knew. Bob didn't leave her side for even a second. If Emily went to the kitchen, Bob went with her. When she sat down to draw, Bob would lie down next to the table. If he went to the bathroom, Bob would position himself by the door. That night, I sat on the floor of my daughter's room while she colored in a notebook. "Would you like to show me the girl?" I asked carefully. Emily nodded. He picked up a blue pencil and began to draw. Small figure. Simple dress. Long hair. And where is it located? Asked. Emily pointed to the door. My heart pounded in my chest. What does she want? Emily bit her lip thoughtfully. She wants to leave. But the man won't let her. The pencil fell from my hand. What kind of man, daughter? Emily remained silent for a few seconds. Then he replied, that which has no face. That night, at 2 o'clock sharp, the camera showed movement again. The larger shadow appeared first. Next the smallest one. But now the smaller shadow was clearer. It was shaped like a child. Bob immediately positioned himself in front of her. The larger shadow moved forward. And then, something different happened. The child's shadow reached out its hand. Bob took only one step back. And for a moment, the shadow remained exactly where the doll had appeared. That's when I realized. The doll was not a toy. It was ourder. After that night, I could no longer pretend that it wasn't happening. I began to observe every detail of the house with different eyes. Every shadow. Every reflection in the glass. Each crack of the wood. Everything seemed heavy with a presence that no longer belonged to this world. But it couldn't leave either. The next day, I decided to take Emily to sleep at my sister's house. I didn't tell her why. She simply said she wanted to spend some time together. When we arrived, Bob refused to go inside. It stopped at the gate and began growling in the direction of our house across the street. Bob, come here, I called. He didn't move. Then I understood. As long as Emily was away from that house, he had nothing left to protect inside. I left my daughter with my sister and returned alone. That night, at 2 o'clock sharp, the hallway remained empty. No shadow, no whispering. But Bob was whimpering at the door, as if something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and turned on all the cameras. The backyard was empty. The room was silent. But in the kitchen recording, I saw something new. Dull. She was sitting on the table, facing the entrance door. And behind her, reflected in the window pane, something dark, tall, and shapeless watched the house. Fear surged through my body like an electric shock. I had taken Emily away from there. But that was still with me. And now it seemed closer than ever. That morning, I realized something that left me completely chilled. Attendance was no longer tied to the 2 a.m. schedule. She had begun to move. Whenever I wanted. Bob didn't leave the front door for hours. He growled into the void, as if someone were standing on the other side of the wood, listening to every sound in the house, waiting for the right moment to enter. I picked up the doll from the table and, without knowing exactly why, took it down to the basement. The house had a small, old basement that we almost never used. I descended the steps slowly. The air down there was cold, damp, and heavy. I put the doll on the floor and, without realizing it, whispered, "You want to leave, don't you?" Silence answered. But the atmosphere changed. I felt like something was there with me. I ran up the stairs and locked the basement door. That night, I slept on the couch with Bob lying at my feet. Around midnight, I heard footsteps inside the house. They weren't coming from the hallway. They came from below. From the basement. Bob jumped up, ran to the door, and began barking with a fury I had never seen before. The walls shook. His bark echoed like a warning. Then, everything stopped. Complete silence. When the sun rose, I found the basement door open. And the doll, he wasn't there anymore. The empty basement was the first sign that I was no longer in control of the situation. I descended the steps carefully, holding the lantern as if it could protect me. The ground was marked with traces of damp earth. They weren't footprints. They looked like marks of something being dragged. The air was colder than the previous night. And, for the first time since I moved into that house, I felt that that place no longer belonged to me. Bob came down with me. Every muscle in his body was rigid, eyes were attentive to every corner of the basement. He growled towards one of the walls, The oldest one, where the plaster was cracked. I brought the flashlight closer. Between two loose floorboards, something was glistening. I knelt down and pulled carefully. It was an old, rusty chain with a star-shaped pendant. Later, in the library, I discovered the truth. The girl who disappeared in that house. Its name was Lily. And that star was identical to the one that appeared in an old photo in the local newspaper. Lily, smiling, wearing that exact necklace. That night, I understood everything. Lily wasn't confined to the house. She was imprisoned at T.O. the Faceless Man. And what Bob did every night. It wasn't just about protecting my daughter. It was confronting the very thing that kept Lily there. I returned home with my heart racing, knowing that the final showdown was approaching. At 2 a.m, the whole house shook. The lights flickered. The hallway grew dark. And the shadow appeared, larger than ever. This time there was no way to escape. At 2 a.m, the air in the house became unbearably heavy. It was as if someone had closed all the windows in the world. Bob was in the hallway, exactly where he always stood. But now he wasn't just watching. He was waiting. The shadow appeared at the end of the corridor, tall, distorted, darker than ever. The child's outline appeared right behind her, faint, unsteady, as if made of mist. "Let her go," I whispered, without realizing I had spoken aloud. Bob took a step forward. The larger shadow also moved forward. The temperature plummeted. I felt a weight on my chest, as if something was pressing me against the ground. The child's shadow tried to move forward. The taller one pulled her back. Bob then did something I will never forget. He positioned himself between the two shadows, firm, motionless like a wall. His bark echoed throughout the house, loud, strong, full of fury and protectiveness. The walls vibrated. The longer shadow receded. The child's outline began to dissipate, like smoke being carried away by the wind. For a moment I saw her face, not one of fear but of relief. The larger shadow emitted a type of sound that I cannot describe. Then, it disappeared. The hallway was empty. The air returned to normal. Bob collapsed to the ground, exhausted. That moment I knew. Lily had finally been freed. The silence after that confrontation was strange. It wasn't a normal silence. It was profound, weighty, almost sacred. The house looked different. Lighter, clearer. Bob lay on the hallway floor for a long time, breathing slowly, as if he had been through an invisible battle that only he understood. I knelt beside him and rested my forehead against his neck. "Thank you," I whispered. The next morning I took Emily back home. She entered slowly, holding my hand. "Mom, she's not here anymore," he said, looking down the hallway. "Who, darling?" "The girl." Bob approached and sat down beside her, calm, peaceful as never before. The following days passed without nightmares, without shadows, no whispers. The house became just a house again. A few weeks later I found a letter in the mailbox, with no return address. It was a clipping from an old newspaper, Lily's photo, and on the back, a single handwritten sentence. "Thank you for letting her go." I don't know who left that there. Maybe nobody. Perhaps someone who was finally at peace. As the weeks passed, the routine returned to normal. Emily went back to playing in the yard. Bob went back to chasing the birds. The nights became silent, without fear, without interruptions. But something in me had changed forever. I began to see the world in a different way. Trusting instincts more. Listening when the silence seemed to speak. To respect the silent courage of someone who didn't need words to protect those he loved. One afternoon, Emily asked me, "Mommy, why is Bob so brave?" "Well, 'cause he loves you more than anything." She hugged his neck and replied, "I love him too." Bob closed his eyes, calm, as if he knew his mission had been accomplished. That day, I realized that some heroes don't wear capes. Some have 4 paws, watchful eyes, and a heart bigger than any fear. Autumn has arrived, bringing a new feeling to the home. Dry leaves covered the yard. The wind blew through the open windows. And for the first time since we moved in, the house felt alive in a good way. One afternoon, while organizing the basement, I found a small metal box, forgotten among old objects. Inside there were old photos of the family who had lived there before. In one of them I recognized Lily. She was in the backyard, smiling, holding a doll. The same doll. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Lily, summer of 2004. I framed the photo and put it on the living room shelf. Not as a reminder of fear, but as a memory of a life that had finally found rest." Bob sat in front of the photo for a few seconds, then calmly stepped away. At that moment I felt that the cycle was truly complete. A year later I sold the house. Before leaving, I walked down the hallway one last time. I ran my hand along the wall where it all began. There were no more marks, it was no longer cold. There were no more shadows. Just memories. Bob was walking beside me. Emily was holding my hand. As we closed the door, I looked back and whispered, "Thanks." I never knew if anyone heard. But I knew for sure that that story had ended. Some heroes bark. Some protect in silence. And some face things that we will never be able to see. Bob did all of that simply because he loved. Before this story continues, I want to ask you something important. Many of these stories are never told. And many heroes are never remembered. By subscribing to this channel, you help keep these stories alive. You help give voice to the moments that matter, to the people and the animals who protect without ever asking for anything in return. So if this story touched your heart even a little, click subscribe now and become part of this community. Because here we don't just tell stories. We honor them.